Hello watch enthusiasts. Now today I'd like to talk about my next watch acquisition, and I've been considering this for a while now, because I've sold various items in my collection. So I still have my favourite watches in the collection, but I've sold quite a few watches now, my Autodromo, and a couple of others which were lying around and weren't being worn very much. Notably my Alpha's gone now too, as is my Orient. And I'm considering now what to buy with the money I've raised and also with my income, and a little bit that I've put aside each month. So in this video I'd like to go over the various options and then ask you for your opinion in the comments down below. Firstly, I have a watch which would be a dress watch these days, but of course in its day would have really been an all-purpose field watch. And this is of course the Tissot Heritage 1936. And this is a watch which I've adored since I first saw it. And I handled it a few months ago in London in a shop. But since then, I must say, I've adored the look of this watch. It's quite large in diameter, but due to its short lug-to-lug distance, due to those wire lugs, it is very wearable. Also, it's such a talking piece, with that beautiful dial with those small seconds, and the manually wound movement through that onion crown. Equally, that Hunter caseback is a beautiful touch and really does add to this watch. With that lovely distressed one-piece strap. For the novelty aspect of this watch and Tissot's good watchmaking, I do think that about £800 for this watch really is a good deal. And I do adore the look of this watch, as I've said, and equally that Hunter back, as I've also said, it is a wonderful way of having an exhibition case back without the fear of such a large case back breaking. It also does hark back to pocket watches, which of course these days are impractical to carry, but this does render a design which wouldn't be practical these days perfectly usable due to the fact that it's incorporated into a wristwatch. Now, the one thing which concerns me about this watch though is the fully polished finish. Now, my real concern with this is that previously I've owned a lot of very rounded watches with a very rounded shape in polished stainless steel. And what often happens is that scratches build up very, very quickly on the surface of the steel, and give the whole watch a very dull effect as a result of these scratches. And as a watch which I intend to wear every day, or at least, every other day when I'm not wearing another watch, I do want to avoid large amounts of scratches and quick wear, which is a concern for me. Though with that said, it is a beautiful watch, and in that way, I certainly can't fault it in terms of design. So this really is an option if I'm looking at the sort of dress spectrum of things. Another option which I've been very seriously contemplating is the Zinos U1. And I will be going for the standard version without the screw-down pushers, because I find I prefer having quick access to my chronograph than having to unscrew the pushers. Equally, one still gets 300 meters of water resistance, so really nothing is lost in that sense. But I adore the look of this watch, and I think I've made it very clear over the last few weeks, reviewing various, at least showing various versions of this watch, that I do adore the look of this watch, and I love that vintage aesthetic to its pilot's chronograph functions. Of course, it is a very functional watch with a day and a date function, along with the chronograph function. Of course, it is also anti-magnetic and heavily water-resistant. Of course, it has a fully polished case, but in this way, because it has the pushers in the crown placed on the side which is going to receive the most abuse, it is somewhat protected. Equally, it has that large PVD bezel, which will take most of the brunt of any sort of scratches that will hit the front of the watch. It does also have a nicely domed crystal, which is something which I love to see on watches. Of course, it does also follow that very old-fashioned pilot's chronograph aesthetic, which one can see on things like the Breguet Type 20, which are all watches which I think are very appealing in terms of their design. Also, as far as value goes, this watch does offer a bidirectional timing bezel, very good lume, a very good movement, the Veljoux 7750, and all of this for a very good price of around the £1,400 mark, which I really do think is tremendous for a watch of this functionality. Also, I love the fact this watch is very much a product of Zinn's history, as a brand which was primarily focused on aviation timepieces until relatively recently, I suppose, over the last 20 years or so. So this really does hark back to a real heritage of a brand which produced truly professional watches and still does produce professional watches for people in the industry. And I do appreciate this and these features being included in production watches. Now, if I were to buy this watch, I would most definitely buy it on a leather strap rather than the bracelet, because for me, pilot's chronographs look best on a leather strap, or maybe a khaki or an olive NATO, but I think really a leather strap is the most appropriate choice. Alternatively, in the Zinn range, I'm rather tempted by a fully tegmented U1. Now, of course, the U1 is the sort of classic diver of Zinn, and I'm not particularly taken by the more recent ones with the sword-style hands. I personally love that Bauhaus effect, which is given by those very squared, even Lego-style hands on that very simple dial. Now, equally, I do rather like the fairly austere nature of this watch. It's not built to be attractive, it's built to merely do its job, and do its job very, very well. Now, technologically speaking, I think the U1 is truly an incredible watch in terms of what it achieves. So it has the version I want is the fully tegmented submarine steel version. So this is a watch which is made of this highly corrosion-resistant submarine steel, as opposed to normal 316L. And this truly is a grade above 316L in terms of resistance to corrosion. But then it's also hardened by Zinn in their tegmenting process, which hardens the whole watch to be 4 times harder than normal stainless steel, making it pretty much impervious to daily scratches. Of course, the water resistance of this watch is also very impressive, with 1,000 metres or 100 atmospheres of water resistance, making this watch truly very, very resilient for the job it's designed to do. It doesn't have a helium escape valve, but for me, as someone who isn't a saturation diver, that's really of no consequence. Equally, it's something else that doesn't need to be resealed when the watch is serviced, so actually it can allow for less expensive services, so at the end of the day this doesn't bother me. Equally, the bezel doesn't have an insert either to be damaged. It is fully tegmented submarine steel, which can be interchanged very quickly with the PVD version if you so wish. Now, the list of features doesn't end there either, because it is also, and this is something which is rarely advertised, it's also very nearly anti-magnetic to 1000 Gauss, so it's very nearly as anti-magnetic as a Rolex Milgauss, which is pretty impressive for a watch which is designed for water resistance and not for anti-magnetism, or to be used in that sort of environment. Now, my only real concern about this watch is in its sizing. This watch is 44mm, which is usually too large for me. That said, though, having tried this watch on, it did fit me actually quite nicely. It was on the large side, but did fit me quite nicely. So this is a consideration, but my real concern is that it won't really fit under cuffs and so on during my daily tasks at work and so on. So I do really want to consider this quite thoroughly before buying a watch of this size. Simply because I am concerned that I won't wear it simply due to it being impractical. So that is something to consider. Now, the next watch on this list is a very, very famous one, and a very well publicised one. And this is, of course, the Tudor Black Bay. Now, I've loved the Tudor Black Bay for a long time. I really have liked the look of this watch a great deal, because I do love vintage Rolexes and vintage Tudors. I also prefer snowflake hands to traditional Rolex Mercedes-style hands, just because I find that Mercedes hands can look a little bit busy on an otherwise very austere, very simple dial, which one sees on these no-date Black Bays. Now, I rather like the blue version, if I'm honest, without the gold on the dial, because I think it harks back to various Tudors from the 1970s, which were used for various expeditions and various diving experiments, which I think really does bring history to the watch itself. And when you're buying a new watch, I do enjoy seeing the history and the background of a timepiece. Equally, in a strange sort of way, I love the simplicity of this watch, the fact that it really is a no-date timepiece which is designed to tell the time and tell a dive time, and that's it. So I do appreciate the design of this watch being very simple and very classical. This is about as classical as you can get in terms of dive watches, in terms of their origin. Equally, I love the fact that it doesn't have crown guards, but rather a little aluminium ring between the crown and the case, which really makes the whole watch more simple and more elegant in my opinion. However, as much as I do like the in-house version, as you've seen so far, I do find the ETA-powered version to be a little bit more comfortable and manageable on the wrist. Now, having tried on the new Tudor version with the Tudor in-house 26 dual movement, I did enjoy the way the watch ran and the fact that it had 70 hours of power reserve. But the issue was that this watch ended up with these very wide slab sides, which one would really only see on a Rolex Deep Sea, or at least proportionally like that on a Deep Sea. And I think this may well be emphasised by the fact that it has a very thin bezel. But nonetheless, I think the sides of the new version are overpowering in their thickness, and frankly the ETA version is manageable as it is, and already has very large sides. So I really do appreciate the shorter and smaller nature of the original. However, on any of these versions, those large sides would be a problem for me, because I often find that watches are simply too thick and too heavy on the wrist, because I do have narrow wrists, which can take slightly larger watches, but not if they're very heavy. And I do find that this watch is a bit unbalanced, even with the bracelet on it, because it tends to rock around on the wrist due to its weight, which is a bit of a shame, really, with such a beautiful design, though that definitely doesn't discount it. Another quite rare alternative to the Black Bay is the Aterna Super Kontiki 1973. And this is really a direct, if slightly larger, replica of the original Super Kontiki from Aterna. And I really do like this watch, because even though it is all polished and likely will age over the years simply due to that very simple finish, I think it does incorporate and encapsulate an era of Swiss dive watches, with these very funky hand types, with the very large minute hands, small hour hands, and very bizarrely considered second hands, with a very simple bezel and those shark mesh bracelets. And I must say, this really does capture that look perfectly, because in terms of a design, this really is as close to the vintage version as you can get without buying one, which I applaud Aterna for making such an accurate replica. Now, like the Tudor, this watch does have an ETA movement inside it, in this case a 2824, which has been regulated quite carefully, which does give a reliable watch, and I suppose is more authentic to the original in that way. Equally, it does compensate for that fairly simple movement with a very complex dial finishing, with very different hands, and a very attractive style of bezel, which is painted but with a sort of off-colour lume pip at 12. So I think overall I love the design of this watch. The only concern really is, again, that fully polished finish will become scratched up very quickly, simply due to the shape it is. But I suppose that's some of the charm of a vintage watch, and watching watch age is one of the wonders of owning one. So I suppose that is a way of looking at it, but nonetheless, as a prospective buyer, that can be a bit of a concern. That said, though, the watch does come on a beautiful mesh bracelet, like the original sort of shark-style ones from the era, without a deployant, but rather with an actual opening piece, which is very different for a bracelet, I suppose, and is like the original bracelet. It's not like one of the more modern ones with deployants and so on, which are often what one sees. Equally, it doesn't have end links, like a lot of bracelets do, but rather actually chains directly onto the spring bars, which is again very true to the original. And these details are things that I really appreciate seeing in a recreation or a replica of a watch from the era. It's very nice to see these hints to the past, when the watch is clearly trying to hark back. Finally, we come on to a watch which I adore, but I think will require a little bit more saving, or at least a few more months of saving. Now, whether or not this is worth it is, I suppose, a question of perspective. But I certainly do think that the Tudor Pelagos in blue is a really wonderful watch, and certainly one which I'm considering buying. So, of course, this is the very famous watch from Tudor, which has acquired a great deal of fame due to its features. So it's a helium escape titanium diver with 500 metres of water resistance, a beautiful matted blue bezel, and a blue dial. Equally, this does hark back in terms of the colouring to their original blue divers with those squared-off indices of the past. Also, the finishing on this watch really is wonderful. The texturing on that dial with that cut-out chapter ring really is like a sort of a modern Submariner, taking those hints from the original, but bring them into the 21st century. Equally, the case is fully brushed, including those bevels down the edges of the case, giving it a dark and tool-like aesthetic, but still with that excellent level of finishing, is still wearable on a daily basis with regards to looking normal and not too sporty. Of course, the interesting way that this watch has been designed is that it's sort of a refined, more modern Submariner, so it does follow those design cues, unlike previous Tudor professional dive watches like the Hydronaut, which took often less aesthetically pleasing designs in the name of a sort of more modern aesthetic, whereas here they really have gone for a classic design, but by refining it and making it develop into a more modern timepiece. Equally, that blue harks back to the French Navy, as was explained to me by a salesman in a Tudor dealership. So, of course, there is going to be a level of trying to convince one, but nonetheless, it's interesting to hear that these were designed to pay homage to watches which were originally issued to the French Navy's divers. Even the lume of this watch has been considered, in that they've used blue lume. Because it's the last colour to disappear on the spectrum as one enters the dark zone of being under the sea, because of course the sort of UV end of the spectrum has the highest frequency and therefore can penetrate the deepest into the water, which is, I suppose, a technical consideration which Tudor really have considered when they made a professional dive watch. Equally, this watch does have one of the best bracelets in the business. It's not quite a Rolex glide lock, but it does have a great deal of adjustment, including a spring-loaded mechanism in the clasp, so when you move your wrist it can expand or contract to give you a better fit. Of course, one can't overlook the movement itself being a 26-joule in-house Tudor movement, which does give one 70 hours of power reserve, meaning that one can put the watch down at the beginning of the weekend, and then pick it up on Monday morning and still have a fair amount of tension on the spring. Equally, it is a chronometer-certified movement, which is nice to see on a watch like this, which really does give one the assurance that the watch will keep time extremely well. Of course, equally, having the in-house movement does also give it a certain kudos when compared to other watches of this price, where a lot of watches aren't chronometer certified for this price, whereas I think Tudor are really making a fantastic watch for a great deal here. Of course, the only real downside here is, of course, the price. This Tudor comes in at in nearly new condition, around £2,500. So this certainly will take a bit of saving up and a while to acquire, maybe a few months. So I hope to get it mid next year if I do choose to purchase this watch. Because I do like to only put aside a little bit each month to allow for the necessities to be paid, food and so on, and to be really safe. Because at the end of the day, watches are my hobby, and they're not the most important thing in the world when compared to eating and being warmed. Anyway, I'll end there before I talk too much about this really wonderful Pelagos. But do give me your comments and tell me what you think about my choices and what you think might be a good idea alternatively, which I haven't considered. So thank you very much for watching. Do please like, share and subscribe if you did enjoy this video and would like to see more on this channel. This is I'm on the Watch Guy, over and out.